The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
World War II started an international arms race.
Britain fires its first H-bomb to join the United States and Russia as ranking atomic powers.
New machines made weapons as precise and deadly as possible.
It's the world's first electronic computer. Right now,
But those machines couldn't function without instructions.
The only requirement now is that we tell our computer what to do. This is the job of an individual called a programmer.
Klára Dán von Neumann, Klári to her family and friends, helped bring one of those machines, one of those famous and infamous objects, to life. And in doing so, she became one of the world's first computer programmers. I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science, where we unearth stories of scientists who didn't receive the recognition they deserved in their lifetimes. Our second season is all about Klára Dán von Neumann and her place in computer history.
I'm Janet Abate, and I'm a professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society.
In 1999, Janet wrote a book called Inventing the Internet.
And while I was working on that, I kept looking for the women in the story.
But she didn't find many.
And I thought, well, my next book, I'm going to go find the women in computing. And I thought there weren't going to be that many because nobody had written about them.
And so she went back to the 1940s, the dawn of electronic computers.
They were just so invisible. I thought, well, there couldn't have been that many, and I couldn't have been more wrong.
The gender landscape of the 1940s computer scene, it turns out, was not completely male-dominated. In fact, it was actually common for women to be coders then. And that's one of the things Janet wrote about in her next book, Recoding Gender. But one name was noticeably absent: Klára von Neumann.
To be completely honest, I know virtually nothing about her.
I've also been writing about computers for a really long time, more than 30 years, in fact. I've read countless histories, and I even co-wrote one in 1996. But last year, as we were putting together our Lost Women of Science list of the overlooked and undercredited, the name Klára von Neumann caught me off guard. She was married to John von Neumann, the famous Hungarian mathematician and computer pioneer. I certainly knew who that was. She worked on Monte Carlo simulations, which were first used for atomic bomb calculations, but have since become a fixture of the computing landscape. Today, the Monte Carlo method is used to make sense of huge volumes of data and do things like predict elections and model the spread of COVID-19. I knew about Monte Carlo simulations, too. Klári also wrote code for the ENIAC, an early electronic computer. Anyone who's spent a good amount of time writing about computers has heard of the ENIAC. But in the middle of all these knowns was this new name, this new character.
Or maybe I shouldn't be surprised that I hadn't really heard about Klára von Neumann. I guess that's the point of having the season.
Indeed, it is the entire point of this season. And so I started digging. And it turns out Klári's life was hiding just out of plain sight. At the Library of Congress, we stumbled upon a trove of documents that were saved alongside her husband's: letters, legal forms, manuscripts, computer code, pay stubs, diaries. Our problem became sorting through the material, constructing a life out of thousands of pages. And to make matters worse, at the Library of Congress,
I think this is a mix of Hungarian and English.
I'm a little worried about all the Hungarian. We should just scan everything. A ton of the material was in Hungarian. Still, we quickly learned the broad strokes of Klári's story. She was from a wealthy Jewish family in Budapest. She married John von Neumann, a famous genius, and she was brought into this coding work kind of randomly. But who was this person really? What can she tell us about the origins of computing? And how did she get so lost? In this season, we're going to get to the bottom of those questions and then some. For this episode, our first of the season, our goals are twofold: to paint a picture of Klári's early years bringing this unusual, colorful character to life, and to lay out the story of how she ended up in the United States, her entry point into a world of secrecy and computers and nuclear weapons. In order to understand this story ourselves, we needed to get our hands on a particular document, a manuscript that would ground us as we mapped out her life. It's a manuscript that we knew existed because the Library of Congress had fragments of it. But we caught wind that the rest of it was somewhere else.
Hi, Katie.
Hi.
Come on in. Oh, my goodness.
It's the very last.
Thank you. Yes, how great. Thank you.
The last dahlias, the last status.
Oh,
look,
my.
they're looking a little peaked, aren't they?
Well, just that one.
I just picked them this morning. I've just arrived in Concord, Massachusetts at the home of Marina von Neumann Whitman, a prominent economist who's now retired. She's Klári's stepdaughter. Klári died almost 60 years ago, but Marina is still holding on to some of her stepmother's old papers. Our first stop, Marina's study. Oh, so that's it there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Wonderful. I'm pointing at 4 files I see on a high shelf. So should I get those down for you?
No, wait a minute. I think I can do it.
Yeah, you're tall.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was taller.
Marina grabs the folders, then leads the way to her dining room table.
Why don't you get a sense of what's there?
The document I'm looking for is Klári's unpublished memoir, and as promised, here it is. So it's 4 folders with little ties on them, and I am opening this one folder that says miscellaneous typescripts, and then drafts of following: Two New Worlds, Not So Mary Washington, The Blue Humber, The Computer, and The Grasshopper. According to the table of contents, the memoir was to be divided into 8 chapters and a postscript. Marina has either full or partial drafts of 6 of them. They're all typewritten in English, a few of them over and over again as Klári produced new drafts, editing by hand in the margins in her familiar, illegible scrawl.
The proposed title was very revealing. It was called A Grasshopper in Very Tall Grass. So she obviously saw herself as this little creature sort of buried in much taller environment. Mm-hmm. I don't think she ever realized how remarkably intelligent she was.
And if Klári was this grasshopper, her tall grass could have been a lot of things, from the towering mind of John von Neumann, her husband, to the skyscrapers in the U.S. where she was an immigrant, from the overwhelming personal tragedies she would one day experience, to the entire universe she would find herself in, surrounded by famous scientists who were building weapons that were unlike anything the world had seen. Klári was already in her mid-30s when she joined these scientists and started to code. By then, she'd already lived many lives. Her path to programming was serpentine and unusual. She herself, complicated and layered. We know the result of her work because we're living in it. The question is, where is she in all of this? And a fundamental part of that question is, who was Klára Dán von Neumann? So before we get into stored program computers and flowcharts and simulation algorithms, we need to take a step back and meet Klári the person, this self-described grasshopper in very tall grass. Klári's story begins in 1911.
I was born shortly before World War I in Budapest.
That's one of our translators, Eva Szabo, reading from the manuscript I found at Marina's.
The capital of that light-hearted, gay country best known for its gypsy music and songs, and for its hopelessly unhappy and unlucky history.
The Budapest of Klára Dán's childhood was in constant flux. By the time Klári was 10, she had lived through a world war and a violent communist revolution in Hungary. But her life wasn't all dark and gloomy.
She came from a very wealthy, aristocratic family.
That's George Dyson, a historian of technology. He wrote Turing's Cathedral, a book about the origins of the digital universe.
She had been a very pampered child, national figure skating champion at age 14.
In an early passport photo we found, she had short, curly brown hair and big, piercing gray-brown eyes. In non-official photos, she wears glasses, and she's often smiling.
And I'm told she was a great beauty.
That's Marina again. George also visited Marina to read Klári's papers. In fact, he beat me by 10 years. He was looking for any material he could find on early computers.
This was the first-person record of all this questionable stuff. What happened during the Oppenheimer hearings, what happened during the Monte Carlo. It's all there in fountain pen. And here's Klári, who just is there and she's doing things, and it was just clear cut.
But long before Klári found herself immersed in the world of Monte Carlo simulations and people like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, back when she was a young girl, her life seemed to be going in, well, not that direction.
She was well educated, but certainly didn't show any interest in science or anything like that.
Klári was not a budding scientist, but she was getting a very idiosyncratic education, surrounded by Europe's best and brightest.
Just sort of this insanely interesting intellectual group of people. You turn around at breakfast and there would be a playwright or an artist or a great mathematician.
Her extended family was large and tight-knit, and they all lived together in separate flats of an extravagant villa, which still stands to this day at the top of the Gellert Hill, one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in all Budapest. And the house
gradually became the center of the Roaring Twenties Budapest version.
At Klári's family home in Budapest, there was a constant flow of celebrated figures in and out. They would host huge parties that lasted all night.
It's sort of a mix between a scientific conference and a rave or something.
There's a word for this kind of event. It's like one of those untranslatable German words, except this one's Hungarian. On the page, it looks like it's pronounced Mulatztag. But, well, here's Eva reading from Klári.
It is absolutely impossible to translate mulatság in one simple word. It is not a party. It is not a feast. It is not even an orgy. It is simply the spontaneous combustion of a bunch of people having a good time.
And Klári loved meeting these colorful characters.
I, a tiny little speck, an insignificant insect, just chirping around to see where the most fun could be had.
Klári defines herself as this little speck, this grasshopper looking for fun. And my first instinct is to fight this, because her letters show a complicated, deep, emotional person, not just a hedonist, and definitely not a speck.
She had huge heart. I mean, she was so very open-hearted, so nice to everybody who she loved.
That's Ági Antal, another Hungarian translator. She's describing the sense she got of Klári after reading a bunch of her letters.
It is a pity that she had not more self-confidence. She should have had. You know how it is. The most brilliant people don't believe how brilliant they are.
Klári was self-deprecating to a fault. Other people seemed bigger and more important. Relationships drove her life. For instance, this is how she frames her memoir.
This is a sort of autobiography about other people.
Among these other people were the men she loved and married. Her marriages gave her access to other ways of living, of being. Through her marriages, she got many things: opportunity, purpose, travel. Marriage for Klári wasn't just an objective, but also a vehicle, a useful one in a man's world. The beginnings of this lifelong search for love and fulfillment are documented in her private diary. We found it buried in a file, in a box, at the Library of Congress. The diary is rich blue and stamped with gold flowers. It's the type of thing you want to admire before opening. Inside is Klári's teenage heart.
3 hosszú évnyi küzdelem és fájdalom. 3 long years of struggle and pain come to an end with this page. I've been living in this intoxication of love for almost 3 weeks.
And this first love, Francis, won her over with his adventurous and impulsive nature. They got married in May of 1931, when Klári was only 19. And the relationship took Klári on something like a tour of Europe's casinos.
I was most frightfully in love. The grandiose flinging of the last chip on the table seemed to me the most manly and elegant gesture, until one day it dawned on me that those color chips were just about all the money we had.
Even Klári, a fan of spontaneity and whimsy, was growing increasingly frustrated by her marriage. And this was how she was feeling one fateful night, when she arrived in Monte Carlo, Monaco's famous gambling hotspot.
And Klára Dán is there with her first husband, who's an inveterate gambler.
That's Anna Bhattacharya, who's just published a biography on John von Neumann called The Man from the Future.
And whilst he's busy gambling away their money, she gets bored and she retires to the bar. But just before she leaves the roulette wheel, she bumps into John von Neumann, a fellow Hungarian. And he's a minor celebrity. A Hungarian would know of him.
This was the early 30s. But Anano says John von Neumann eventually became almost as well known as Albert Einstein. Some considered him even smarter. As a child, he memorized entire chapters of books, and it's said that by 8, he had mastered calculus. Here's how John von Neumann's friends described him in a 1966 documentary.
While still in his 20s, von Neumann had already solved Hilbert's 5th problem for compact groups.
Essentially, it was his genius at synthesizing and analyzing things.
Proved the mean ergodic theorem.
That's what Johnny could do, and what no one else could do as well.
Provided a mathematical foundation for quantum theory.
He would think all the time.
Proved the minimax theorem in theory of games.
He worked with tremendous energy and fantastic speed.
And done basic work in foundations of mathematics.
Von Neumann was considered almost a species apart.
And that night in Monte Carlo, Klári found this powerful, almost mythical brain sitting at the bar. She would later recall that Johnny was, quote, babyishly plump and round like a child's drawing of the man on the moon. He was wearing his characteristic 3-piece suit. He would never be caught dead in anything else, even on hikes or horseback.
They start chatting, and he explains he has a system to win.
Of course he does, right?
It's fail-safe, he says. So he loses all his money.
That's some system.
Yeah, it turned out it wasn't foolproof. And so he then finds her at the bar and basically says, "Will you buy me a drink?" And she agrees. And they chat, and they get on like a house on fire.
But this was the early 1930s, and Klári was married, and so was Johnny. So Johnny went back to his wife in the U.S., and Klári stayed in Europe with her husband. And life went on for a while. But this meeting in Monte Carlo was important. For one thing, these two people liked each other, and they wouldn't forget it. And for another, Monte Carlo would reappear in a place they couldn't have expected. In the late 1940s, Klári and Johnny would work on a computer program to execute a mathematical algorithm. And that algorithm would be named for that very gambling hotspot. It's called the Monte Carlo method.
The Monte Carlo method uses a statistical sample.
That's Nick Lewis, a historian of technology at Los Alamos National Laboratory.
In order to make predictions about parts of the natural world, say the motion of particles, without having to do detailed calculations on the possible behavior of every single particle.
So, the Monte Carlo method imagines many possible outcomes of a particular event, like the motion of particles. And then it simulates the event over and over again to determine the probability of each outcome. It uses randomness to solve problems.
And it's sort of a window into the way that physics is really working.
For example, say you're sitting at that roulette wheel in Monte Carlo placing your bet. The ball will land in one of 37 slots. But what would it take to derive an equation accounting for every variable? The ball's initial position, its kinetic energy, its angular momentum, and all the other factors, the friction acting on the ball, the ricketiness of the table, the crookedness of the house. It's reasonably simple to state mathematically how each individual factor shapes the odds for what the ball will do in the next small fraction of a second. Spin smoothly, deflect from an obstacle, or settle in a landing slot. But deriving a single equation to predict the odds for final landing positions directly from starting conditions is much, much harder. So instead, Monte Carlo uses statistics. It plays endless rounds at a simulated wheel, collects the data, and presents its findings. Meaning, with the Monte Carlo method, you're living out the possible scenarios of what could happen to get a sense of what's probable. But in simulating all of these scenarios, in walking down all these paths, the unlikely is eventually, inevitably realized. And this ability to map out not only what is probable, but also what is improbable, might be a fitting analogy for Klári's own life. She went down many random paths.
It was sheer luck and a strong tendency for rainbow chasing that made me a wanderer on 2 continents among this maze of people.
Until she kind of just fell into the world of computing by way of a marriage.
Klára von Neumann, as far as we know, did not have an interest in mathematics or science or nuclear weapons.
Yeah, she really was just, in the right place at the right time.
And so, although a life full of bomb calculations, coding, and famous physicists was not the most probable one for a young figure skating champion from Hungary, it had a non-zero probability, and she, this grasshopper always looking for better horizons, sampled different outcomes until she landed there.
Her life was improbable, but not impossible.
Coming up, we'll look at what happened after 2 Hungarians walked into a casino and met at the bar. I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science. Klári's chance meeting with Johnny at Monte Carlo had ripple effects that spanned an ocean. Their relationship changed the course of her life and maybe the course of early computer programming, too. Soon, Klári would face the Second World War to occur in her lifetime and in its aftermath take part in making deadlier warfare possible. But in the early 1930s, this reality was still very far off. Klári was married to someone else, and so was Johnny. And besides, he lived halfway across the world in Princeton, New Jersey. He worked first at the university there as a visiting professor, then later as mathematics professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. And that's where he went after that brief encounter at the casino, returning to his work and his wife, Mariette. Their daughter, Marina, yes, the same Marina from earlier, says her mother was a shining star.
She liked being the center of attention, and I think it annoyed her that she was so much in the background.
And Johnny, as Anano points out, wasn't always the doting husband.
He was never very plugged into any kind of domesticity. He was pretty clueless.
And so, as may be expected,
she rapidly gets tired of being a rather distant second in von Neumann's list of priorities, which, he's described by his friends as being addicted to thinking. And so Mariette leaves him for another physicist, actually. And he never really understands why.
Johnny was heartbroken and confused. Why would she trade a perfectly fine genius husband for a non-genius husband? And so, in 1937, in the midst of his heartache, Johnny went back to Budapest for a visit.
And he basically looks up Klára Dán. Unfortunately, Klára has remarried, this time to a banker who's 18 years older than she was.
While Johnny had been in Princeton, Klári had kept herself busy in Budapest. After that fateful night in Monte Carlo, Francis, Klári's first husband, kept gambling away their money. In one extreme episode, Klári and Francis took a road trip across the south of Europe. Francis lost all of their cash, and then some, stranding them in northern Italy without enough gas money to get home. When Francis continued gambling after that, they finally got divorced in 1936. And then, a month later, Klári promptly replaced him with his opposite, a respectable banker, 18 years her senior. In her memoir, she calls him her daddy husband.
He was a kind, gentle, attentive husband, and I was bored to tears.
So, while yes, she was married, Johnny's return to Budapest in the summer of 1937 could not have come at a better time.
They start talking first on the telephone, and then they started meeting in cafes, and they'd talk for hours. And she said the subject of conversation veered wildly from politics to ancient history, and the differences between America and Europe, and the advantage of having a small Pekingese or a Great Dane.
It became perfectly clear that we were just made for each other.
They were immediately obsessed with each other. And again, she was just so magnetic and charming and carefree in a way. And he was the smartest guy she'd ever met.
But, like summer camp, it had to end. Johnny went back to the U.S. and Klári stayed in Budapest. But there was no stopping things.
And their exchanges continue through letters and telegrams.
Hundreds of these letters and telegrams are now preserved at the Library of Congress. Klári's own files are largely subsumed by her husband's, and 4 of us spent the better part of a week there looking for anything we could find in Klári's tall, sloping hand. At first glance, her elegant old Hungarian script looks like a seismic readout. The words themselves are bunched up on the page and they slant to the right as if headed somewhere. We had trouble telling which of her many languages these were written in. Her native Hungarian? English? Or were we seeing some rare use of her German or French? She knew them all. Johnny's letters also seamlessly moved from language to language. But unlike Klári's, his have been sorted, pored over, and, luckily for us, transcribed and translated. And so a lot of what we pieced together of their relationship came from Johnny rather than Klári. And Johnny started writing to Klári immediately after that romantic interlude in 1937. Here's Nandor Tori reading from one of Johnny's letters.
A billion thanks for the letter. It is lovelier than anything I could imagine. Warmer than anything I ever hoped. It's altogether the sweetest thing. It's almost like yourself.
These early love letters are unbelievably sweet. Still, it quickly became clear that the woman Johnny had decided to hitch his heart to was a complicated person. There's one letter in particular, which I call the long, dark letter. It's about 10 pages. Gianni wrote it on a stopover in Milan in August of 1938. This long, dark letter is a stunning document, really, because it demonstrates with remarkable prescience the rocky, emotional road ahead for these two people. The letter shows that Gianni cared about Klári deeply.
Is this evil world bothering you all night? The world that does not give you what you should have deserved long ago, happiness. My heart breaks to think of you being worried and restless in a long, dark night.
Their impassioned letters are a blizzard of emotional outpouring. They suggest a couple who were constantly reaffirming their connection. These are two people who weren't simply infatuated. They were well matched. Gianni, the fiery but jovial scientist with a mind in perpetual motion, and the equally fiery, quick-witted, fun-loving Klári. As for Klári's current husband, the boring banker,
the inevitable, of course, happened.
And she tells her husband that basically their marriage is over, and he seems to take it pretty well.
In 1938, a few months after Klári's 27th birthday, Klári and Gianni got married.
Klári's divorce comes through at the end of October. They get married within 2 weeks, and they sail back to America the next month in November.
Klári seemed like the sort of person well-suited to such a move. She was a well-seasoned traveler. She was good at adjusting to new people and places. But when the couple finally got to Princeton, it wasn't quite the newlywed life that Klári had imagined, even jaded as she was by her prior marriages. For one thing, Gianni was immediately hard at work at the Institute for Advanced Study, leaving Klári to her own devices in this totally foreign place. And also, this was 1938.
All this time, of course, war is creeping closer.
All these treaties of different military powers are leading to war. I believe more than ever.
Germany had already annexed Austria, and Hitler was poised to invade Poland. And Gianni and Klári's Jewish families were still in Budapest. And so, in 1939,
she actually returned to Europe. Klári goes back to try and convince her parents and von Neumann's mother and brother to leave. Klári manages this, but she stays to conclude family business and wrap things up.
Gianni's letters suggest that Klári's father dragged his feet in leaving Budapest and that he wanted Klári to see to some important matters, perhaps liquidating some assets or selling off property, all of which kept Klári in Europe for too long.
Johnny is writing to her desperately.
Darling, for God's sake, do not go to Pest and get out of Europe by the beginning of September. I mean it. Don't be a fool. Come back.
He knew how bad things were in Europe and how it really was a matter of life and death to get out of there.
Klári knew it was dangerous, too. Like many other Jews in Europe, she and her family had converted to Catholicism, as did Gianni, to stay safe in the face of rising anti-Semitism.
She was really quite extraordinary. She had the most remarkable presence of mind.
Klári set sail on August 30th, 1939. Then, just as Gianni predicted, on September 1st...
These are today's main events. Germany has invaded Poland.
She also clearly was quite lucky because she jumped on that boat just in time.
So as war broke out in Europe, Klári was sailing towards her new life in the United States. It might not be surprising to hear that someone on marriage number 3 by age 27 was prone to discontent. And when faced with discontent, Klári took action. She was constantly gambling, taking chances on unusual characters and dipping into new, strange worlds. But her letters and memoir don't reveal a thoughtless or frivolous person. Just like the Monte Carlo experimenter, Klári was harnessing randomness towards her own ends. She was striving for something, willing to completely upend her current life for the hope of something more and better. Next time on Lost Women of Science, where that got her. This has been Lost Women of Science. Thanks to everyone who made this initiative happen, including my co-executive producer Amy Scharf, producer Sophie McNulty, associate producer Ashreya Gupta, senior editor Nora Matheson, composer Elizabeth Yunan, and the engineers at Studio D Podcast Production. Thanks also to our voice actors Eva Szabo and Nandor Tari, as well as our many Hungarian translators Agi Antal, Rick Espenshade, Charles Hebert, Laszlo Marcus, Alina Bessonnier-Williams, and Lehel Tari. We're grateful to Mike Fung, Kathy Bennett-Warner, Dominique Guilford, Jeff Delvicio, Meredith White, Bob Wachter, Maria Clave, Susan Kerr, Jeannie Stivers, Linda Grace, Rabbi Michael Paley, Marina von Neumann-Whitman, George Dyson, Thomas Haig, and our interns Hilda Gitchell, Kylie Tanganan, Lisa Kopaeva, and Juliana Russo. Thanks also to the Computer History Museum, to Paula Goodwin, Nicole Searing, and the rest of the legal team at Perkins Coie, and to the Institute for Advanced Study, the Library of Congress, and the UCSD Special Collections for helping us with our search. Many thanks to Barnard College, a leader in empowering young women to pursue their passion in STEM, for support during the Barnard Year of Science. A special shout out to the Women's Audio Mission in San Francisco, where this podcast was recorded. Lost Women of Science is funded in part by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Schmidt Futures, and the John Templeton Foundation, which catalyzes conversations about living purposeful and meaningful lives. This podcast is distributed by PRX and published in partnership with Scientific American. You can learn more about our initiative at lostwomenofscience.org or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Find us at Lost Women of Sci. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Katie Hafner.